my story vis-a-vis HIV begins in New York City. Moved to New York City for a job and decided to get my doctorate at Columbia. And during the period of time that I was finishing my doctorate, HIV was just beginning to show itself. And my doctorate was in epidemiology. And so this was a really challenging problem for those of us who were scientists in the field, trying to figure out what HIV was. HIV had a profound impact on the gay population and politically and intellectually and structurally really had a huge impact. It had a huge impact into the scientific community, especially the biomedical community, because the idea of a retrovirus causing disease and that a virus that was so sophisticated and functioned the way that HIV did was a revelation. I remember arguing whether or not it was an infectious disease because it didn't, at least at the outset, present itself the way an infectious disease might show itself. The delay between infection and disease manifestation was so long that there really, at that particular point in time, were no models for that type of infectious process. So it was a confusing time, and I got personally involved when the Commissioner of Health from New York City, a guy named Dave Sensor, who before that time actually run the CDC, Dave Sensor called me up and asked me if I would join a group of people to talk about what's going on with gay men in the city and this disease. We formed a small organization that used to meet, can't remember exactly where, but I have this vision of a church basement, but it was nothing more than a bunch of chairs in a circle with the Commissioner of Health and his assistant and a bunch of people from the gay community. We call that the New York AIDS Network. And it was the forerunner to gay men's health crisis and all the sort of big corporate style HIV response. It really was the first organized response in the city. I remember in the years before I left New York, I could walk down the street and people would scream at me from across the street because they knew who I was and they knew I worked for the health department. And they just did not want to believe that this was an infectious disease. They didn't want to believe it was a disease that they didn't have control of. There was a competing argument that AIDS was caused by too much sex, too much exposure to semen, use of poppers, all these kind of self-deprecatory attitudes that gay men could take about themselves. But at least they then owned the disease. It wasn't this random phenomena that just happened to hit the community. And so it was a tough time. It was a tough time to try to establish disease control programs. It was a tough time to try to convince people what the disease process was. And it was a tough time because we really didn't understand very much. And I left New York because it was becoming such a difficult and untenable place to live. There was just so much sadness, it was overwhelming. And the city itself, the infrastructure of the city at that particular point was really falling apart. It was a horrible place to live. We moved here, so we moved to Seattle. So this is 1986. And I got a job. I got the job I got because of the work I'd done with HIV. I had a certain, I was known within a certain slice of the scientific community. People knew who I was. You know, my moment of fame. And I think that got me the job, but the work I did had nothing to do with HIV. From that point on, the impact of HIV in my life was personal, wasn't professional. And it still was devastating. My partner that I moved here, with whom I moved here from New York, died in 1990. And his death was horrible. It was one of those slow, painful declines. And it was just devastating to live through that. And in that period, once again in Seattle, so many friends were dying. It wasn't like New York. It wasn't as awful for reasons I can't understand. I don't think the epidemic was as bad here as it was in New York, but it was certainly here, and there was certainly plenty of loss. Dying of HIV was awful. It was painful, it was long. Your body just turned into something no one wanted to look at, and you didn't want to look at it either. You know, it was a horrible experience, and you never knew its trajectory. It could go on for a long time, or it could happen quickly. I've had a lot of fun in my life. I've traveled a lot. I've seen a lot. I've done a lot, and that's because I never said, "Oh, I can wait and do this later." If an opportunity presented itself, or I made an opportunity, I would take it. And you know, maybe to some extent, I owe that attitude to HIV, the realization that this is all temporary, and to push opportunities off into the future was not a very sensible way to behave. You'll never regret having spent money having a good time.